Ever had an HOA take things way too far? You pay your dues, follow the rules, keep your lawn trimmed, and expect to be left alone. That was me, until everything flipped because of one person. She wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-declared queen of the lake. Always watching, always complaining, and always stirring up trouble. Let's just call her Karen. Now, I've lived by the lake for years. It's the main reason I bought my property in the first place. The view, the quiet mornings, and most of all, my boat. That boat wasn't just a toy. It was my escape. Every weekend, I'd take it out on the water, relax, fish, and unwind from the chaos of the workweek. It was my peace. But peace and HOA Karens don't mix. At first, it started small. A few passive-aggressive notes about the noise my boat made. Mind you, it's electric, almost silent. Then came complaints about how I parked my trailer. Then she started attending every HOA meeting just to bring up my name. I shrugged it off. I didn't think much of it. People like that usually run out of steam. But not this one. She was just getting started. One morning, I went out to the dock. My boat wasn't floating. It was sinking. At first, I thought it was a mechanical issue. But after checking the footage from my security cameras, my stomach dropped. There she was, caught on video, walking down to the dock in the middle of the night with a drill in her hand. I couldn't believe it. This woman actually drilled holes in my boat. I reported it, of course. Filed a police report. Shared the footage with the HOA board. And guess what they did? Nothing. Not a warning. Not a fine. In fact, they backed her up. Said I was bringing hostility to the community. Can you imagine? I was the problem now. And the kicker? They fined me for leaving debris in the lake after the boat went under. That was the moment something in me changed. I realized I'd been playing defense too long. These people weren't just neighbors. They were running a little power club, and I wasn't part of it. So, I started digging into the HOA, their leadership, their land rights, everything. And what I found shocked me. They had made a mistake. A big one. The land they built their little HOA office on? It wasn't technically part of their jurisdiction. And it was for sale. That's when the plan started forming. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to end their control over my lake for good. Keep watching, because what happened next will make every HOA horror story you've ever heard sound like a bedtime tale. I bought this property years ago specifically for the lake access. It was one of those peaceful, out-of-the-way spots where you could actually breathe. No crowded beaches, no tourists, just open water and quiet mornings. For a long time, it was perfect. The kind of life people dream about. But the one thing I didn't see coming was the HOA. At first, it seemed harmless. Just a group of residents keeping things in order, making sure the neighborhood looked nice. But over time, it became something else entirely. A power grab. And at the center of it was Karen, the same woman who thought she had the right to decide who could enjoy the lake and who couldn't. She somehow got herself elected to the board and acted like she was running a government. Every little thing became a problem. Where you parked. How often you cut your grass. What color your mailbox was. Then came the rules about the lake. They started putting up signs. No boating before 9 a.m. No dock modifications without written approval. They tried to tell me I couldn't even tie my boat to my own dock because it was unsightly. It was ridiculous. I ignored most of it. After all, I owned the land, and they didn't have any real say over the water itself. Or so I thought. But they weren't just writing rules. They were acting on them. Quietly, behind the scenes, they had changed a few bylaws and created a new committee to oversee lake safety. Guess who the chairperson was? Of course. Karen. And not long after that, she started doing inspections. First from the shoreline, then from my actual dock. I caught her walking onto my property one morning like she owned the place. She said she was just checking on a reported violation. No warning. No permission. Just trespassing, plain and simple. Things escalated from there. I tried talking to the HOA board, but they either ignored me or defended her. Said she was doing her job. When I asked for meeting transcripts or proof of the rule changes, I got stonewalled. That's when I started asking around the neighborhood. Turns out, I wasn't the only one. Several others had their own stories. Broken fences, threats of fines, harassing letters for minor things like leaving out trash bins too long. One guy even got a notice for having a noisy wind chime. But what really made my blood boil was hearing how Karen bragged at meetings. Said the lake was meant for responsible residents, and that outsiders were abusing it. By outsiders, she meant anyone who didn't agree with her, including me. After she sank my boat and got away with it, I realized this wasn't just a grudge. She wanted control, full control over the lake, the land, and anyone who used it. And the HOA was letting her do it. That's when I went looking for a way to fight back, not with yelling or lawsuits, but with something much stronger. It started with a simple land records search. It was supposed to be just a routine look through the county records. I didn't expect to find anything major, maybe some small technicality I could use to push back. But the more I looked, the more I realized something didn't add up. The HOA was acting like they owned the lake, the docks, and everything around them. But legally, that wasn't true. See, most HOAs are built into the neighborhood from the start. They're tied to the land through what's called a covenant, which basically outlines their authority. But this one wasn't. It was formed years later, when a group of residents got together and decided they wanted more structure. The original developer didn't even set it up. That already made their position shaky. But it gets better. Their so-called lake office, the little building they operated from, wasn't even within the official HOA boundary. I double-checked it 3 times to be sure. According to public records, the lot the office sat on was technically owned by a private trust. And it had recently gone up for sale. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. The building where they held meetings, wrote fines, printed those passive-aggressive newsletters, was sitting on land they didn't even own. I called the number listed on the property record and spoke with the agent. She confirmed it was still available. I didn't hesitate. I made an offer that same week. Quietly. No attention. No public posturing. Just business. And a few days later, the deal closed. The land, and everything on it, was mine. They had no idea. For the next few days, I watched them go in and out of the building like nothing had changed. Meetings were held. Papers were shuffled. Karen even parked in her usual spot, right up front like she was the mayor of the lake. I didn't say a word. I just waited. I had the deed, the survey, and the legal documents all lined up. Then came the letter. I drafted a formal notice revoking their use of the property. It was polite, direct, and 100% legal. I gave them 14 days to vacate. No response. Not even a phone call. Just silence. So, after the deadline passed, I showed up with a crew, a demolition permit, and a bulldozer. They must have thought it was a joke when they saw the machines roll in. Karen came storming out, red in the face, screaming something about illegal activity. I handed her a copy of the property title and told her she had 30 minutes to remove anything personal from the building. The office was coming down. And it did. In less than 2 hours, the whole thing was leveled. Just a pile of splintered wood and broken pride. The HOA's command center? Gone. Their little clubhouse of control? Flattened. And the best part? I didn't break a single law doing it. But the fallout? That was just beginning. Word spread faster than I expected. By the next morning, nearly the whole neighborhood knew what had happened. People were walking their dogs a little slower past the now empty lot. Some looked shocked. A few nodded in approval. And then there were those who pretended not to notice, but you could tell. They knew exactly why that building was gone. Karen. She went silent. No Facebook rants. No HOA emails. Nothing. She vanished like a ghost, at least for a little while. The board scrambled. They tried to meet in someone's garage, but no one wanted to host them. Suddenly, all that power they used to throw around meant nothing. Without the office, without the land, they had nowhere to go and nothing to stand on. I started getting messages from neighbors I barely even talked to before. People thanking me. One guy said he'd been fined $100 just for putting up solar lights on his fence. Another told me Karen once threatened to report his kids for playing in the lake after sunset. Turns out, everyone had a story. Everyone had just been putting up with it, thinking they couldn't do anything about it. But now, they saw that wasn't true. The HOA tried to push back, of course. They sent a formal letter claiming I had interfered with association business. I sent one back, attached with my property deed and a friendly reminder that their office had been built illegally on land they never owned. A week later, I got a letter from their lawyer. I responded with one of my own, plus a request to cease all further communication unless it involved property I actually shared with them. That shut things down pretty quickly. But I didn't stop there. I requested a full audit of the HOA's records, citing my rights as a property owner within the community. I wanted to see where the dues had gone, how the fines were being used, and who approved what over the past 2 years. And that's when things got interesting again. Missing receipts, unapproved expenses, payments made to companies with no clear connection to the neighborhood. It wasn't just mismanagement. It looked like someone had been helping themselves to a little extra. Karen finally resurfaced when the board called an emergency meeting at the local library. I went, of course, front row seat. She tried to play the victim, said I had attacked the heart of the community, and accused me of trying to destroy the HOA. But the room didn't react the way she expected. People were tired. Tired of the power trips, the bullying, the double standards. She didn't have support anymore. And without her little kingdom, she had nothing left to hide behind. No office. No control over the lake. No more threats to hold over anyone's head. The tide had turned, and for once, it wasn't in her favor. The real fun started once the HOA realized they weren't going to intimidate me or back me into a corner. After Karen's little speech at the library meeting, things started to unravel for her. She thought the neighbors would rally behind her, but they weren't buying it anymore. People were tired of the constant control, the ridiculous fines, and the unnecessary rules. What they didn't expect was the flood of complaints that came after I started demanding answers. It didn't take long for me to learn just how deep the mess ran. After I requested the HOA's financial records, I got my hands on something I hadn't planned on, a series of emails between the board members. They were talking about property deals, unapproved payments, and how they could fine people without cause just to make extra cash. It was all right there in black and white. These weren't just minor mistakes. They were full-blown violations of their own rules, all hidden behind the mask of a well-run community. I knew I had them now. So, I shared everything I had with a few neighbors who had been hit hardest by the HOA's schemes. I knew we needed to act fast, before Karen and the others could come up with some excuse. But the more I dug, the more I realized how much they had been getting away with. The fines weren't just random. They targeted specific people, the ones who didn't fit into Karen's idea of what the neighborhood should look like. I wasn't about to let that slide. Armed with everything I'd uncovered, I sent an email to everyone in the community. I laid it all out, how the HOA had been abusing its power, how they'd been fining people unfairly, and how they had been operating illegally. I didn't just send it to my neighbors. I sent it to local news outlets and even the city council. I wasn't just airing dirty laundry. I was starting a movement. The response. Instant. Calls started coming in. Messages flooded my inbox. People were fed up. They were ready to stand up to the HOA, to make sure no one had to live under the thumb of a corrupt system anymore. Within a week, we had a meeting set up to discuss everything I had found. And Karen, well, she wasn't invited. When the meeting took place, the room was packed. I had the community backing me up, and it was clear. People wanted change. Karen and the rest of the board had no choice but to sit there, listening to their neighbors speak up about all the ways they'd been wronged. The best part? They couldn't deny anything. Not with all the proof on the table. It felt good, seeing the tables turn like that. Watching Karen's face as she realized the power she'd held for so long was slipping away, piece by piece. But I wasn't done yet. I still had one last piece to put into motion. The final move that would make sure they never tried to pull something like this again. It wasn't just about getting revenge anymore. It was about making sure they could never threaten anyone again. Things started moving fast after that meeting. The HOA was on the defensive, scrambling to cover up their tracks, but it was too late. The more they tried to explain themselves, the more they dug themselves into a deeper hole. People in the community weren't just upset anymore, they were ready to take real action. The mood had shifted, and Karen could feel it. She had no idea what was coming next. I wasn't satisfied with just exposing the corruption. No, I needed to make sure that the HOA never had the power to hurt anyone again. That's when I took another look at the land records, and realized that the lake access itself was vulnerable. The HOA didn't own the water rights either. They were using a loophole, convincing residents that they had control over everything that touched the lake. But the truth was, the lake belonged to the city. I had already made moves to secure my own property. But now, I was looking at the bigger picture. If the HOA didn't control the water, if they didn't have the rights to make arbitrary rules, I could completely flip the script. I started reaching out to others who were just as fed up, those who'd been pushed to the edge by Karen's overbearing tactics. One by one, they started to sign on, agreeing that it was time for the community to take back what was theirs. We set up a meeting with the city council, bringing all the evidence we had. The financial records, the board communications, the proof of Karen's shady dealings, it was all laid out in front of them. It didn't take long for the council to see that the HOA had been running a racket. They'd been acting beyond their authority for years, violating not just local laws but also basic property rights. The council was on our side. They agreed to launch an investigation into the HOA and their activities. But that wasn't enough for me. I wanted to make sure Karen and the rest of the board faced real consequences. So, I did what I knew would hit them where it hurt. I started pushing for a public hearing, demanding that all their actions be brought to light. The media got involved. Local news stations were covering the story, and suddenly Karen wasn't the hero of the neighborhood anymore. She was the villain. The community's support was overwhelming, and soon enough, the council agreed to strip the HOA of any power they had left. Karen's reaction? She tried to put on a brave face, but it was clear she was losing control. At the next board meeting, she walked in like she owned the place, but the room wasn't backing her anymore. The same people who once feared her were now speaking up, calling for her removal from the board. There was no coming back from it. The once powerful HOA that had tormented so many of us was on its last legs. And it felt incredible. But as it all unraveled for Karen, I couldn't help but think, this wasn't just about my boat or my land anymore. It was about standing up to the kind of person who thought they could dictate how others lived. And for once, the community was united, not by fear, but by the will to fight back. The day of the public hearing finally arrived, and you could feel the tension in the air. The entire room was packed, with residents from every corner of the neighborhood showing up. The media had their cameras rolling, and you could see Karen sitting there, her usual confident demeanor completely shattered. The board, once her loyal followers, were starting to look nervous as the community began to demand answers. I had no intention of letting them off easy. The community had been silenced for too long, and now it was time for everyone to see just how much damage Karen and the HOA had caused. As I stood there, watching the room fill with people who had been wronged by the board's actions, I realized just how much this had grown beyond me. It wasn't just about my boat anymore. It was about every person who had been unfairly fined, every resident who had been forced to live under Karen's thumb, and every single one of us who had been made to feel powerless in our own homes. The council opened the floor to public comments, and one by one, residents stood up. They shared their stories of how Karen had terrorized them with petty complaints, unreasonable fines, and constant harassment. Each story was more outrageous than the last. A woman talked about how Karen had once called animal control on her for letting her dog play in the yard too loudly. Another resident spoke about the time Karen had tried to get a family evicted for simply having a birthday party at their house. It was clear that the HOA had been abusing its power for far too long. As the stories piled up, I could see Karen getting more and more uncomfortable. She shifted in her seat, her face growing redder with every word. The board tried to defend her at first, but it was obvious that their credibility was slipping fast. They had no real response to the growing list of complaints. And then, it was my turn. I stood up and addressed the council, laying out the entire story. I showed them the proof, the emails, the financial records, the unauthorized fines, and of course, the demolition of the office. I didn't hold back. I made it clear that the HOA was not just corrupt, it was dangerous. It had overstepped its bounds, and it was time for it to be dismantled. By the end of the hearing, Karen was practically shaking. The council members, who had initially been hesitant, were now fully on our side. They agreed to a full investigation into the HOA's actions and promised to take immediate action to revoke their authority over the lake. Karen and the board were no longer in control. The power had shifted, and it was in the hands of the community now. When the hearing was over, I could see the weight lifting off the shoulders of the people in the room. They weren't afraid anymore. For the first time in years, they felt like they had a voice. And as for Karen, well, her reign of terror had officially come to an end. The fallout was inevitable. The community was done letting one person run everything with an iron fist. The battle was over, and we had won.